Each one seems to have a little bit different theme. Sometimes there's some overlap there, but they're all very good, and there's a lot of good truth in these. Philippians chapter 1, we'll look starting in verse number 3 through verse number 11. It says in Philippians chapter 1, verse number 3, I thank my God upon every remembrance of you, always in every prayer of mine for you all, making requests with joy for your fellowship in the gospel from the first day until now, being confident of this very thing, that he which hath begun a good work in you will perform it unto the day of Jesus Christ. Even as it is meet for me to think this of you all, because I have you in my heart, insomuch as both my bonds and in the defense and confirmation of the gospel, you are all partakers of my grace. For God is my record, how greatly I long after you, you all, in the bowels of Jesus Christ. And this I pray, that your love may abound yet more and more in knowledge and in all judgment, that you may approve all things that are excellent, that you may be sincere and without offense till the day of Christ, being filled with the fruits of righteousness which are by Jesus Christ, unto the glory and praise of God. So as we look at this, hang on just a second, one more announcement. Chris, y'all's move. Can you give me the time and date on that real quick?
We're loading up the truck July 14th at 2:30 p.m.
2:30. And that's Young Tower, correct? Okay, so if any of you guys can help, July 14th, 2:30, and we'll get that announced again on Sunday. Help them load up. Even though we don't want to see folks go, we still have to help them load up and move out. So July 14th, 2:30. All right.
I won't be there, so.
Oh, convenient. Of course. July 14th. What day is that on?
Sunday.
Okay, Sunday. Okay. Boy, you'd think a guy going to the ministry, never mind. All right. This book of Philippians is an interesting book. It's probably one of the most personal letters that Paul writes. He had a very close relationship with these people. He started the church. He planted the church there in Philippi, and he actually visited it 2 more times later on. He did some jail time there. And when he was in a Roman jail, the Philippians were one of the few groups of people that ministered to him. And so he had a really close relationship with these folks. And it kind of reflects in the prayer and the book. In the letter, let me ask you, what is the commentary theme for the book of Philippians? Joy. Okay, does anybody know how many times the word joy appears in the book? I mean, not rejoicing. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice. It's not very many times. I just personally don't buy that one. What I do see a focus on and emphasis in the book, especially in chapter 1 and 2, is Christ. Now, we can have joy through Christ. Of course, we have salvation through Christ. But this is a strong letter on the doctrine of Christ and what he's done. I mean, you go into chapter 2. Who's chapter 2 all about? It's about Christ and what he's done, and that we should be like-minded and those kind of things. But look in chapter 1. I just highlight things, and hopefully as you're studying, you underline or highlight certain things that you just kind of keep seeing over and over. It helps in our study if we notice what we're reading as we're reading. In chapter 1, verse 1, we see Jesus Christ. Notice in chapter 1, verse 2, Jesus Christ. Chapter 1, verse 6, Jesus Christ. Chapter 1, verse 8, Jesus Christ. Chapter 1, verse number 10, Christ. Chapter 1, 11, Jesus Christ. Are you starting to see a little theme there? Maybe? Chapter 1, verse 13, Christ. Chapter 1, verse 15, Christ. Chapter 1, verse 16, Christ. Chapter 1, verse 18. And you can go on and on through this chapter and see over and over again, Paul is immediately focusing his friend's heart and mind on who? Christ. There's also a focus here in this first chapter on the gospel. Notice in chapter 1, verse number 3. Excuse me, not verse number 3. Chapter 1, verse number, where's the first one here? Got to put my glasses on. Chapter 1, verse 5, he says, for fellowship in the gospel. Chapter 1, down in verse number 7, confirmation of the gospel. Chapter 1, verse 12, The things that have fallen out for the furtherance of the gospel. Verse number 17, he's set in defense of the gospel. Verse 27, again, your conversation is becometh the gospel of Christ. And so we see here some themes that are developing that really repeat over and over throughout the book. And so while there is an idea of joy and rejoicing in the book, there's some other big ideas here too, that as you're studying, don't get sidetracked just because maybe you read in a book somewhere that the joy is a certain, or the theme is a certain thing, and miss these things that repeat over and over and over in the book. Okay? So he's writing to his friends here, and he's very close with them. There's some personal things here. Notice verse number 3. He says, I thank my God upon every remembrance of you. Then in verse 4, always in every prayer of mine for you all, making requests with joy. So Paul is constantly praying for these people. Can I encourage you, urge you to pray more and more for people, especially fellow believers? Paul says he prayed for you all. That's a pretty inclusive term. It implies what? What does that term you all imply? No, he'd say y'all. You all is a northern thing. Y'all, if he's from the south, he'd say y'all. Okay, so he's not from the south, but he does use the word reckon. So what is it? If I come in here and I say I pray for you all by name, what does that imply? I know your names. Okay, I heard somebody say encourages you. It should be an encouragement, but it implies that I know who you are. I know a little bit about you. I take the time to think through, this is what's going on in Art's life. He was sick as a dog yesterday, and I catch him out on a lawnmower at 8 o'clock this morning. I'm praying for Art. Lord, please don't let him fall off that lawnmower. Please don't let him pass out here. The friendship and the relationship is reflected here in these words, that Paul was concerned about these people because he knew them. He knew who they were. He knew what they were encountering in their lives. He knew some things going on. And so he's constantly praying for them. He's constantly giving thanks for them. I just put a little takeaway note for me: get to know people better. It's amazing how many people in a church our size, which is not a big church, people who don't know each other. We have this idea of, if somebody wants to know me, they can do what? They can come up and talk to me, right? Well, that's pretty biblical, isn't it? No, it's really not. If you want friends, what does the Bible tell us to do? Show ourselves friendly, get to know people, talk to people. We're not going to really know specifically what to pray for other people if we don't talk to other people and get to know folks. Probably totally off the subject, and I probably shouldn't say it. One of the biggest hindrances, one of the biggest hindrances to getting to know people is electronics. I saw something yesterday morning. Brianna and Bethany McCoy, they were at our house, and they were playing. And you know what these two little girls were doing? They were outside, running around, laughing, climbing trees, throwing rocks in the wood, making little houses out of sticks. You know what they weren't doing? They weren't walking around with their face in the phone, all pouty and mopey, which is what most people do nowadays. They were having real fellowship. And I'm just convinced, folks, that the more we get our face in these little boxes and walk around all pouty and mopey over what's going on everywhere else, it cuts down on this concern for other people because we get wrapped up in our own little world. It wasn't that way back in the day, and I'm trying to pray cell phones away. I'm sorry, I just okay. But there was real fellowship here, and that's the point we're looking at. These folks knew each other. Paul was concerned about them. He was not only thankful for them, he was thankful for their fellowship. Notice in verse number 5, that commonality they had was based on Christ in the gospel and their work in the gospel. And then he was constantly praying for them that they would be continuing to grow, that Christ would be continuing to work in them and conform them to his image until the day of Jesus Christ. And so we get down here and he finally says, all right, now I'm praying for you. We get this background about his friends, about his concerns for them, about his knowledge of them, that he's praying for them, he's thankful for them, he's rejoicing in their fellowship. And he says in verse number 9, and this I pray, that your love may abound yet more and more in knowledge and all judgment. The first thing he prays for is the growth of their love. Let's stop and park there for a little while. This is something that we just can't skip over. Too many churches, too many people in churches get caught up on all kind of things that they think are important, and they leave this idea of love out. Well, you know, if this was more organized, church would be better, or if we did this, or if we didn't do that, then things would be great, or if we did it my way, or if we did this, or if we didn't do that, then... And you look at that a lot of times and you say, well, yeah, there is truth there, but is that what it's really all about? You look at the emphasis, what is the big emphasis of the New Testament in the local church? Love for one another, unity in the body. Is it if we have the best and most streamlined organizations and activities and those kind of things? That's the creation of man that people have exalted into the place of the things of God. According to 1 Corinthians chapter 13, we can do all those things and do them well, but if we don't have love, what do we have? Nothing. And this is not just a Paul idea. We find this idea repeated throughout the New Testament. I want to show you just a couple. Of course, we know Jesus in John chapter 13 told us the identifying mark of the believer is what? That we have love one for another. We read in almost all of Paul's epistles the need for the brethren to love one another, but a lot of times we don't think about Peter and some of the general epistles. So let's look just for a minute back to 1 Peter. Peter was there when Jesus made that statement. So let's see what he encourages the believers to be involved in. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse number 22. He says in verse 22, seeing you have purified your soul in obeying of the truth through the Spirit. Okay, so who's he talking to here? Believers. All right, folks who have been saved. Notice what he tells them. Because you're saved, notice this, have an unfeigned love for the brethren. And then he adds on to it, see that you love one another with a pure heart fervently. Listen, if it always has to be my way, if it always has to be best, if it always has to be the biggest, who am I going to love? Who's the person I'm primarily loving? Me. And there's so many people in our churches that are so wrapped up in themselves and what they've done or what they want to do that we miss this whole New Testament-wide idea that God's people need to be primarily loving God's people. Notice again in Peter, look over at chapter 3, 1 Peter chapter 3, verse number 8. It says, finally, be ye all of one mind. There's that unity I mentioned just a minute ago. Be ye all of one mind, having compassion one of another, love as brethren, be pitiful and be courteous. So this whole idea of the way God's people are to be interacting with one another, this characteristic of love that Paul mentions over and over in almost every one of the prayers that we've looked at, and the ones we'll look at, this idea of the brethren loving the brethren resurfaces over and over and over again, folks. Too many times that we just can't ignore it. We can't just play like it's not there and continue the way we've continued because that's what we know. No, we need to allow God's Spirit to conform us to His image. Let's look over at 1 John. Throughout the book of 1 John, we have characteristics of those who are believers. 1 John chapter 2, verse number 10. Well, let's start at verse 9. 1 John chapter 2, verse 9. He that saith he is in the light and hateth his brother is in darkness even till now. All right, so there's a characteristic. You can claim to be a believer, but if you're hating your brethren, where are you dwelling? In the darkness. Verse 10. He that loveth his brother abideth in the light, and there is none occasion of stumbling in him. So we see here this characteristic of love is a characteristic of a believer. Look over in chapter 3. Chapter 3, verse number 10. It says this, in this the children of God are manifest. Okay, the word manifest, what does it mean? Clearly shown, clearly seen. All right, so children of God are clearly seen in this following thing here, and the children of the devil. So there's a contrast. We can clearly see the children of God, and we can clearly see the children of Satan basically on what he's about to say here. Whosoever doth not righteousness is not of God, neither neither is he that, notice, loveth not his brother. Jesus said, by this will all men know you're my disciples, and throughout the time, almost from that time, man has been supplanting that and replacing it with busyness in church, doing things. But here again in John, John makes it very clear, writing under inspiration of the Holy Spirit, you're clearly manifesting what you really are by the way you interact with your brethren. Look down in verse number 14. We know that we have passed from death to life. There's a statement of assurance because we love the brethren. Not because we come to church every week, not because we've been in church for a long time, not because we carry a Bible, but because we love the brethren. All those other things are things that anybody can do. Loving the brethren is something that's Spirit generated. Okay, we can't love each other on our own. We're not lovable people. All right, I don't want to offend any of you, but none of us are lovable people, and in our own hearts we know that. All right, we know we're prickly. We know we get irritated. We know we've got our silliness that we do. But it's through the power of the Holy Spirit working in our lives that we can love one another and have that kind of bond that Paul had with the Philippians. All right, look over at chapter 4. Chapter 4, verse number 7. It says, Brethren, let us love one another, for love is of God, and everyone that loveth is born of God and knoweth God. He that loveth not knoweth not God, for God is love. You just can't get much plainer than that. Let's look down in verse number 11. Beloved, if God so loved us, we ought also love one another. And so when Paul makes this statement back in Philippians chapter 1, that he's specifically praying for these people who were friends of his, first and foremost, that their love would abound, that it would keep growing, it would just overflow. It would be that word abound back in Philippians chapter 1. Let's go ahead and go back there. The word abound there in Philippians chapter 1 is a progressive idea, that it'll continue being there, it'll continue overflowing, and it will continue working in the midst of the people. You know, there are a lot of things it's good to pray for, but we really need to pray that God's people will have a love one for another. And that love will continue to grow and continue to progress. Again, understanding that we're people, we're going to do things that irritate people, we're going to do things people don't agree with, but the Spirit makes us bigger than those things. The flesh makes us smaller than those things, and we respond accordingly, right? If we want to respond like little people, we're walking in the flesh. But through the Spirit, He makes us bigger than that, so we can deal with people, realizing that people have to also deal with who? Us. Okay? So he's saying here, pray for these people. I'm praying that your love continues to grow. And then as we continue through the prayer, we'll see love first leads to some other things, but since we're out of time, we'll stop there tonight and we'll take some prayer requests. So let me pray.